There's a strange hush that only comes before chaos, a silence so dense it feels like the world is holding its breath. That's the moment I realized something wasn't right. My name is Christian Turner, and for the past 10 years I've repaired lighthouses along New England's rugged coastline, but nothing in my career prepared me for the terror I encountered at Saconnet Point Lighthouse. It began as a routine maintenance call. The light had gone out. A simple repair, I thought. I decided to handle it late that night, hoping for a clear day tomorrow. The job itself was uneventful, but as I made my way back to the skiff, I noticed something troubling. The engine wouldn't start. I tried everything, fuel checks, troubleshooting, desperate prayers, but the skiff refused to respond. Then came the realization. My phone had no signal. Panic began to creep in as the sun dipped behind the horizon. My boss, Jack, wouldn't even notice I was missing until tomorrow, if then. I grabbed what little I could from the boat, tools, a Kindle, and some personal items, and retreated to the lighthouse. As night fell, the storm rolled in. At first it was subtle, a distant rumble, the air heavy with electricity, but soon it became a ferocious beast, slamming waves against the rocks and whipping salt water against the lighthouse windows. Lightning lit the sky in jagged bursts, and the wind howled like a living thing. The light in the tower failed again, plunging me into darkness. As I struggled to repair the system, I felt it, a cold unease creeping up my spine. Something was watching. I moved to the eastern window, drawn by an inexplicable pull, and that's when I saw her. A little girl. She stood on the jagged rocks at the base of the lighthouse, her tiny figure illuminated in brief flashes of lightning. Barefoot, unclothed, and utterly still, she stared into the storm with unblinking dark eyes. My brain raced to make sense of it. How could a child be out there in this weather, surrounded by a raging ocean? Instinct overrode reason. I ran. I don't remember descending the stairs or navigating the slick rocks, but before I knew it, I was standing behind her. "Sweetie," I whispered, my voice trembling as I reached out and tapped her shoulder. She turned, her expression eerily calm, and opened her arms. Despite the storm, despite the oddity of her presence, I picked her up. She felt impossibly cold, her wet skin like ice against mine. I carried her back to the lighthouse, wrapping her in my shirt and socks, desperate to shield her from the storm. Inside, she seemed strangely unaffected by the ordeal. She didn't shiver, didn't cry. When I asked her name, she only stared at me with those dark, unblinking eyes. Occasionally, she'd giggle when I asked her to wiggle her fingers or toes, as if the situation were some kind of game. And then she spoke. "The storm," she said, pressing her tiny face against the window as thunder roared outside. "The storm." I tried to make sense of her cryptic words, but exhaustion overtook me. I set up a makeshift bed and laid down beside her. Her breathing was steady, calming even, and somehow I drifted into a restless sleep. My dreams were filled with chaos. Thunder so loud it shook the earth, lightning that scorched the sky, and winds that screamed like 1,000 tormented souls. I woke, gasping for air, the room illuminated by a faint glow from a distant lightning strike. And she was gone. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to my feet. She had been lying against my chest. There was no way she could have left without waking me. I rushed to the window, and there she was, standing in the rain. This time, she wore my soaked shirt, the fabric clinging to her small frame as she reached out, beckoning me. Her tiny hand made scooping motions, urging me to follow. My gaze shifted, and that's when I saw it. A Coast Guard cutter speeding toward the lighthouse. Relief washed over me. Rescue, warm blankets, food. But my hope was short-lived. The cutter didn't slow. It slammed into the jagged rocks, the hull tearing apart as if it were paper. I watched in horror as the ship disappeared beneath the waves, its lights extinguished in an instant. The girl hadn't moved. She stood there, her hand still beckoning as if none of it mattered. I stumbled outside, rain lashing against my face as I approached her once more. This time I didn't touch her. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice cracking. She turned slowly, lightning illuminating her face in a blinding flash. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time, she smiled. "I told you," she whispered, her voice soft but chilling. "I am the storm." Thunder roared as her laughter echoed through the night, a sound that wasn't human but something far older, far darker. And then she vanished. I'll never forget the day my grandfather told me the story. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he spoke, and his eyes, once sharp and gleaming with the wisdom of years, narrowed with a shadow of something darker as he recounted a tale from his past. He was a sailor, born in the rugged shores of Scotland, and had seen more of the world than most men could dream. But even after all those years, this story was one he never truly shared. It lingered in his heart, like a dark secret. The tale, he said, had been haunting him since his youth, since the night he set sail on a supply ship to the most remote lighthouse on the Scottish coast. On the west coast of Scotland, far beyond the safety of the mainland, there lies an island so desolate that few would even think to set foot on it. It's a bleak, windswept place. Its lone structure, a lighthouse that has stood against the battering winds of the sea for centuries. It is the only building on the island. The rest is open moorland, barren and unforgiving. The nearest mainland is almost 50 miles away. No one lives there anymore. The light is automated now. But when my grandfather was just a boy, the lighthouse was manned by 3 men, isolated for months at a time in a world that had no connection to the rest of humanity. Imagine the isolation, I tell you. Picture yourself, cut off from the world for 3 months at a time. No internet, no television, nothing but the sound of the howling wind and the crashing waves against the rocks below. Only the occasional supply ship to break the monotony. These men, my grandfather included, lived in a time when the Great Depression had gripped Scotland, and the world felt smaller, darker. The lighthouse keepers were not given the luxury of modern communication, no radio to send word if something went wrong. The only company they had were each other and the endless stretches of bleak, unwelcoming land. The story begins in December of 1934, though the first signs of something going terribly wrong went unnoticed. On the first Saturday of the month, the supply ship arrived at the lighthouse as usual, bringing fresh water, tinned food, and paraffin to fuel the light. The men, 3 in total, greeted the sailors with smiles and whiskey. It was a routine that had become predictable, even mundane. But as the month passed, something started to feel wrong. It was subtle at first, like a distant whisper on the wind. The first sign came on December 15th, when a Norwegian ship, passing along the coast to Liverpool, noticed that the lighthouse light wasn't shining. The sailors shrugged it off. The lighthouse had gone dark before. It wasn't unusual for a storm to disrupt the light after all. Then, on the 22nd of December, a fishing vessel reported the same thing. The light was out. This time the authorities took notice, but only just. They sent a relief vessel on Christmas Eve to investigate. But the weather was too treacherous, the waves too violent. The ship was forced to turn back, unable to get close enough to investigate. All they could confirm was that the lighthouse was dark. It was as though the island itself had gone silent, as though the light had just vanished. But it wasn't until December 27th that the truth began to reveal itself. My grandfather was aboard that relief vessel, along with several local men, ready to face the wrath of the winter sea. The weather was fierce, the wind howling like some ancient beast, but they pushed forward, determined to find out what had happened. When they finally arrived at the island, it was late afternoon. The lighthouse stood tall and empty against the darkening sky, its black silhouette stark against the fading light. There was no glow, no warmth, no reassuring beacon. The sailors docked the ship in silence, their hearts heavy with unease. As they approached the lighthouse, they saw it. The door was wide open, swinging in the wind. My grandfather's boots crunched in the snow as they entered, their lamps casting long, jittery shadows on the walls. Inside, the scene was eerily calm. Too calm. The gas lamps had all gone out, their flames snuffed in the cold. The men quickly relit them, their hands shaking in the chill. They moved through the lighthouse, slowly, cautiously. In the tiny kitchen, the table was set for lunch. Plates, cutlery, and cups arranged neatly. A pot of broth sat forgotten on the stove, but it had long since gone moldy, its contents spoiled. The bedrooms were no better. The beds were unmade, the sheets disturbed, as if the men had been in the middle of some routine. Yet their winter coats were still hanging in the closet. Their boots, heavily worn and sturdy, sat by the door, ready for the harsh weather. They wouldn't have left without them. The keepers had to have been inside not long ago. The place wasn't just abandoned. It was as if the men had simply disappeared. The sailors began their eerie search of the island. The small rocky isle, barely 14 acres in size, was hauntingly featureless. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to take shelter from the creeping dread. It was as empty and haunting as the void. They scoured every inch, peered over the cliffs into the dark, jagged rocks below, and yet there was no sign of the missing men. They had vanished into the haunting unknown. My grandfather found the lighthouse's logbook in a drawer, its pages yellowed with age. The entries were unremarkable, routine records of weather and passing ships, until the last one, which ended abruptly on December 14th. The final entry read, December 14th, 1934. High winds, southwesterly. Ship passed, flag unidentified. Odd colors. Ship stopped, then resumed its journey. That was it. No further entries. No sign of what happened after that. The log simply stopped. The sailors and my grandfather returned to the ship, their minds filled with confusion and unease. They made their way back to the mainland, their hearts heavy with unanswered questions. The news of the disappearance spread quickly, and soon the families of the missing men were informed. A naval ship was sent out to conduct a more thorough search, but like the first relief vessel, they found nothing. No bodies, no trace, nothing. What happened to the men? That question lingered like a shadow over Scotland, unanswered and dark. Some say the men were swept away by a freak wave, but how could they have been outside without their coats? The lighthouse itself was untouched. Others suggest one of the men went mad, killing his companions. But how did he escape the island without a boat? Theories ran wild. Some claimed it was an abduction by a foreign ship, perhaps with sinister motives. Others whispered about the possibility of something far more unnatural, aliens, or a mythical sea creature dragging the men to their deaths. I once asked my grandfather what he thought. He looked at me, his gaze distant, like he was seeing something far beyond the room. He paused, then simply said, "If I told you, you'd think I was crazy." He never told me. And now, with him gone, I'll never know. There's something about a road trip through the dense, darkened woods that feels unnatural, almost predestined to end in something terrible. And then, looming in the distance, a haunting lighthouse stands, its light flickering like a ghostly beacon, casting eerie shadows that dance in the fog. My mother's house sat at the edge of Pine Hill, one of Maine's oldest and most isolated towns, nestled deep in the New England woods. It was always an arduous journey to reach her, though not entirely because of the distance, but because the winding labyrinth of roads seemed endless, the trees so thick they swallowed the daylight whole. Pine Hill had once thrived as a logging town, but as the years wore on, it had become a forgotten relic, left behind in the wake of progress. By the time my father left her, the town had begun to wither, and the memories of its prime faded into the quiet whispers of the forest. My mother had stayed there, alone on Red Hawk Hill, 20 minutes away from the heart of Pine Hill. I often wondered if she had felt as alone as the town itself, or if she had come to find peace in the solitude. After my father's departure, she confided in me, sobbing, that he hadn't just left her, but everything they had built together. And so, when Hurricane Sue came roaring through, destroying what was left of the town's infrastructure, I wasn't surprised when my mother finally called me. Her voice, thin and fragile, asked if she could leave Pine Hill behind and come live with my fiancée Alice and me in Connecticut. I had thought she would die there, the remnants of the town and her heart buried under layers of moss and forgotten dreams. It was late August when Alice and I packed the moving crates into my father's old 1994 Honda. It was going to be a long trip, and Alice wasn't thrilled about spending her weekend on chores, but she never complained. She never once mentioned the musty smell of my mother's deteriorating home, nor did she say anything about the life that had been left behind. Alice had always wanted an autumn wedding, and I wanted nothing more than to make her happy. The first leg of our trip was a blur, the concrete jungle of suburbia slipping away as we headed towards the rural stretches of Maine. By the time we veered off Route 59, it was already late afternoon. The sun was low, casting a golden hue over the fields, and the heat hung heavy in the air. As we continued down the unfamiliar roads, the trees grew thicker, and the sky darkened more quickly than I expected. The silence between Alice and me deepened as we drove under the dense boughs of the towering pines. It was as if the woods were closing in on us, a barrier between us and the world we left behind. Alice's voice broke the silence, a breathless gasp that sliced through the tension. "What was that? Did you see it?" Her voice was unnervingly weak, something in it not quite right, and I immediately knew something was wrong. It was nothing like the calm, confident tone she always carried. "What was it?" I asked, trying to mask the rising unease in my own voice. "A deer," I suggested, though I knew deep down it wasn't. I could feel my heart starting to race as I glanced at her, searching for any sign of what was causing her discomfort. "No," she replied, her voice shaking. "It wasn't a deer. It was like a dog, but not a dog. It looked right at me. No. It was like a person." I let out a quiet sigh, trying to calm her down. "Babe, the woods play tricks on you. It was probably just a coyote or a wolf. This place has a way of messing with your mind." But Alice wasn't having it. "I know what coyotes look like. That wasn't one." I tried to dismiss her concern, but I could feel a cold sweat starting to form at the back of my neck. Something was off, and no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, I knew this wasn't just a trick of the mind. We continued driving, and Alice curled up in her seat, her eyes wide, scanning the darkness outside. I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the headlights cutting through the forest like twin spotlights. Every so often the trees would shift in the shadows, and my mind would play tricks on me, imagining faces in the bark, or creatures lurking just beyond the light. And then it happened. I caught it out of the corner of my eye. The headlights illuminated the woods ahead, and for a split second I saw something that didn't belong. At first it was just a blur, a flash of white eyes staring out from the shadows, too large and too haunting. But then it was clear. The thing that stood just off the road wasn't any animal I had ever seen. Its eyes were milky white, glowing unnaturally, and they stared straight at me. Its face was distorted, human but somehow wrong, with an elongated mouth, wide and grotesque, dripping with saliva. It looked like a hyena, but not entirely. Its smile was far too wide, too unnatural. It felt like it was mocking me, like it knew something about me that I didn't. I froze, my grip tightening on the steering wheel, my breath catching in my throat. "Alice," I whispered, unable to tear my eyes away from the thing in the woods. "Alice, do you see that?" Her body tensed beside him, her gaze flicking out the window. She gasped again, her hand gripping his arm so tightly it hurt. "What the hell is that?" she murmured, voice trembling. "It knew you. It knew everything about you." I slammed my foot on the accelerator, and the car surged forward, the headlights swinging wildly in the dark. But the image of those eyes, that twisted, mocking grin, stayed burned into my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, stalked by something that wasn't human. For a while neither of them said anything. The silence between them was heavy, almost suffocating. He focused on the road, but it was hard to ignore the dread that crept up his spine, tightening with every mile. The darkness seemed to close in around them, and he couldn't help but feel that something was following, keeping pace with their car, always just out of sight. "How far is it to your mother's place?" Alice asked, breaking the silence. 45 minutes, he replied, though it was hard to tell in the dark. The road seemed to stretch on endlessly, with no signs, no landmarks to mark their progress. "Will it be safe there?" she asked, her voice strained. I hesitated, not sure how to answer. "I hope so," I said finally. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't enough. The woods outside seemed to whisper, as if the trees themselves were speaking, mocking them. And as he glanced at Alice, he saw the same fear reflected in her eyes. Something was out there, something they couldn't explain. Without warning, there was a loud thud, a sickening noise like something heavy hitting the roof of the car. I slammed on the brakes, the car jerking to a stop. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, and that's when I saw it. Blood. Thick, dark blood smeared across the windshield. Alice screamed. We both scrambled out of the car, our hearts pounding in our chests. The woods were pitch black, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. The headlights of the car cast an eerie glow, but they only seemed to amplify the darkness, stretching the shadows into impossible shapes. Behind us, there was a trail of blood, leading off into the woods, disappearing into the underbrush. "It's alive," Alice whispered, her voice barely audible, filled with terror. "It's still out there." I turned around, my mind racing. What was out there? What had just attacked us? The next few minutes felt like an eternity. Panic set in as I climbed back into the car, slamming the door behind me. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, the car's engine roaring to life. I didn't know what was chasing us, but it was out there, and we had no way of knowing how much time we had left. Alice was silent now, her face pale, eyes wide. She covered her nose and mouth with her shirt, her body trembling with each breath. The stench in the car grew unbearable, a putrid, suffocating smell that made my stomach turn. "What the hell is that smell?" Alice gasped. "It smells like your mother's house." I could feel the panic rising inside me. The air was thick with fear. My heart hammered in my chest, my throat tight with terror. What had we brought upon ourselves? What had we seen? What had we disturbed in the woods? I glanced over at Alice, but she was no longer looking at me. She was staring out the window, her eyes wide, filled with something I couldn't name. Suddenly the car lurched, the engine stalling. I could feel something close, something massive, something alive just beyond the trees. And then I heard it, the sound of something moving in the darkness, something coming for us.